A Kingdom Transformed. London, 1918. Rose Kensington ran her fingers over Captain Thomas Sinclair's name on the war memorial, tracing every familiar letter. Then, as she blinked, the stone was smooth beneath her fingertips. His name had vanished. Chapter 1. The Vanishing Name. The damp chill of a late October morning in London seeped into Rose Kensington's bones, mirroring the icy dread that had taken root in her heart. The armistice was imminent, they said. Whispers of peace, tentative and fragile, were carried on the wind like the falling leaves swirling around her ankles. Yet, here, in the shadow of the newly erected war memorial in her small borough, peace felt a lifetime away. Or perhaps a betrayal. Her gloved hand, trembling slightly, reached out to touch the cold, smooth granite. Just moments ago, she had been tracing the meticulously carved letters. Captain Thomas Sinclair. The name, so familiar, so deeply etched in her memory, had been a tangible link to the man she loved, the man she had promised to wait for. A promise she now feared she could no longer keep, not in the way she'd intended. She had run her fingers over his name countless times in the past weeks, finding a strange solace in the act. A way to feel close to him, even across the vast, bloody chasm of the war that had swallowed him whole. Each groove, each curve of the letters, had resonated with memories. The way his smile crinkled the corners of his eyes, the warmth of his hand in hers during their stolen walks in Hyde Park, the hushed promises whispered under a sky full of stars, before the world had gone mad. But now the stone was smooth, blank, as if Thomas Sinclair had never existed. As if he were not one of the brave souls who had sacrificed everything for king and country. As if her heart hadn't broken into a million irreparable pieces when the telegram arrived, stark and brutal in its brevity, informing her of his death at the Somme, 2 years prior. Rose blinked once, twice, certain it was a trick of the fading light, the mist playing havoc with her weary eyes. She rubbed the spot again, harder this time, the rough granite scraping against her glove. Nothing. Just the cold, unyielding stone, mockingly smooth. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through the numbness that had enveloped her since receiving that dreadful telegram. This couldn't be. It was a mistake, a cruel joke of fate. Memorials were for the dead, for the honored fallen. Thomas was dead. She had the telegram, folded and refolded countless times, tucked away in her worn leather-bound diary, a constant, agonizing reminder. "Excuse me," she said, her voice trembling as she turned to a man in a somber gray coat who was placing a wreath of poppies at the base of the memorial. He looked up, his face etched with the same weariness that seemed to hang heavy over all of London. Did you see? Was there a name here before?" The man frowned, his gaze following her outstretched hand. "Here, madam? I don't believe so. I've been coming here every day since it was unveiled. This section has always been empty." He gave her a look of pity, the kind she had grown used to, the kind that made her want to scream. "But Captain Thomas Sinclair," she insisted, her voice rising slightly, tinged with desperation. "He was here. I saw it. I touched it." He shook his head slowly. "Perhaps you're mistaken, madam. The war, it does things to the mind. Grief can play tricks." He offered a small, sad smile. "I lost my son at Ypres. Sometimes I see him everywhere." He turned back to his wreath, his shoulders slumping with a grief so profound, so palpable, that Rose felt a pang of shame for her outburst. She retreated, backing away from the memorial, her mind reeling. Had she imagined it? Had grief finally driven her to the brink of madness? She had clung to the memory of Thomas, to the hope, however faint, that somehow, somewhere, he was still alive. A foolish, childish hope, she knew, but one she couldn't quite relinquish. The war had taken so much. Her brother, Edward, lost at sea. Her father, his spirit broken by Edward's death, succumbing to pneumonia just months later. And Thomas, the heart of her, the soul of her, ripped away from her, leaving a void that nothing could fill. She walked home through the thickening fog, the gaslights casting eerie shadows on the wet cobblestone streets. The city, usually bustling with life, felt strangely muted, holding its breath, waiting for the official declaration of peace. But for Rose, the silence was deafening, amplifying the turmoil within her. Reaching her small, sparsely furnished flat, she mechanically went through the motions of her evening routine. She lit the small gas stove, the blue flame flickering weakly, casting dancing shadows on the walls. She made herself a cup of weak tea, the lukewarm liquid doing little to soothe the growing unease in her stomach. She sat at her small kitchen table, staring at the chipped porcelain of her teacup. She had to be rational. She was a woman of logic, of reason. She had worked as a volunteer nurse at St. Bartholomew's Hospital, tending to the wounded and dying, witnessing horrors that would haunt her dreams for the rest of her life. She had learned to be strong, to be resilient, to compartmentalize her emotions. But this was different. This defied logic. This struck at the very core of her being, threatening to unravel the carefully constructed facade she had built around herself. She pulled out her diary, the worn leather comforting against her palm. She opened it to the page where the telegram was tucked, her fingers tracing the faded ink. "We regret to inform you Captain Thomas Sinclair killed in action this Somme. It was real." She hadn't imagined it. But then, what of the memorial? What of the vanishing name? A sudden, unsettling thought struck her. What if Thomas wasn't dead? What if the telegram was wrong? What if someone wanted her to believe he was dead? The thought was absurd, preposterous. Yet, it took root, growing like a weed in the fertile ground of her grief and confusion. A tiny spark of hope, flickering in the darkness, a hope so fragile, so dangerous, that she almost dared not acknowledge it. She closed her diary, her heart pounding against her ribs. She couldn't dismiss it. She had to know. She had to find out the truth, no matter how painful, no matter how impossible. She owed it to Thomas. She owed it to herself. Tomorrow she would go to the War Office. She would demand answers. She would uncover the truth behind the name that was never carved. Or was it? The uncertainty was a physical ache. She stood, the chair scraping against the floorboards, a sharp sound in the quiet room. The tea had gone cold. Just like her hope, just moments before. But something new was brewing, a resolve she hadn't felt in years. A determination. Chapter 2. Whispers in the War Office. The War Office, a colossal edifice of gray stone, loomed before Rose, its imposing presence a stark reflection of the bureaucratic labyrinth she was about to enter. The building seemed to hum with a nervous energy, a palpable tension that mirrored the impending armistice. Crowds of people, anxious relatives, somber-faced officials, and wounded soldiers on crutches surged through the vast entrance hall, their voices a low, murmuring drone. Rose clutched her worn handbag tighter, her knuckles white against the faded leather. Inside, nestled amongst her meager possessions, was the telegram, the crumpled piece of paper that held the key to her shattered world. And the photograph. She hadn't dared look at it yet. Not today. She had dressed carefully that morning, choosing a simple, dark blue dress and a sturdy, though slightly worn, coat. She wanted to appear respectable, determined, but not overly emotional. A woman seeking answers, not a grieving widow lost in despair. The image she'd cultivated during her years at St. Bartholomew's, calm efficiency under unimaginable pressure, was a shield she desperately needed now. The air inside the building was thick with the smell of stale tobacco, disinfectant, and the faint, underlying scent of fear. Rose approached a long, imposing counter, behind which a harried-looking clerk sorted through a mountain of paperwork. He barely glanced up as she approached. "I need to inquire about Captain Thomas Sinclair," Rose said, her voice surprisingly steady, despite the tremor in her hands. "2nd Battalion, Royal Fusiliers." The clerk sighed, a sound that conveyed years of bureaucratic fatigue. "Name and regiment again, please." Rose repeated the information, enunciating each word clearly. The clerk ran a finger down a seemingly endless list in a thick, leather-bound ledger. He flipped through several pages, his brow furrowed in concentration. Sinclair, Thomas Captain, he muttered to himself, then shook his head. No record of a death notification being issued. Are you certain of the regiment? Rose felt a flicker of hope, quickly followed by a surge of confusion. Yes, I'm certain. I received a telegram 2 years ago. She pulled the crumpled telegram from her bag and placed it on the counter. The clerk unfolded the telegram, his eyes scanning the brief, impersonal message. He frowned again, a deeper crease forming between his eyebrows. This is unusual. The date the psalm, but there's no corresponding record in our files. What does that mean? Rose asked, her voice barely a whisper. The hope was growing, fragile but persistent, like a stubborn seedling pushing through concrete. It means, the clerk said slowly, looking up at her with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion, that according to our official records, Captain Thomas Sinclair was not reported killed in action. Rose's head spun. She had to lean against the counter for support. This was impossible. Yet, here it was, the confirmation she had both desperately craved and deeply feared. But the memorial, she stammered. His name, it was there. And then it vanished. The clerk raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. Madam, I assure you, our records are meticulously maintained. Errors are rare, especially concerning matters of life and death. He paused, then added, with a hint of condescension, perhaps you were mistaken. Grief, I was not mistaken, Rose interrupted, her voice sharp, her composure finally cracking. I saw it. I touched it. And I know what I received in that telegram. She pointed to the paper, now creased and worn from her handling. The clerk looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, he sighed again, this time with a hint of resignation. Very well, madam. I'll make further inquiries. But I must warn you, this could take time. And there's no guarantee we'll find anything. Time is something I have, Rose said, her voice regaining its strength. And I'm not leaving until I have answers. He scribbled something on a piece of paper and handed it to her. Go to room 307. Ask for Mr. Alistair Finch. He handles unusual cases. The way he said unusual made Rose's stomach clench. Room 307 was located on the 3rd floor, at the end of a long, dimly lit corridor. The air here was even more stifling, heavy with the weight of secrets and unspoken truths. The walls were lined with closed doors, each bearing a small, brass plate with a name and a title. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the occasional muffled cough or the distant clatter of a typewriter. Rose hesitated before knocking on the door marked Alistair Finch Special Investigations. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for whatever lay behind that door. A voice, crisp and slightly impatient, called out, "Enter." Rose opened the door and stepped inside. The room was small and sparsely furnished, dominated by a large, cluttered desk piled high with files and documents. Behind the desk sat a man in his late 40s, with thinning hair, sharp, intelligent eyes, and a perpetually weary expression. He was impeccably dressed in a dark suit, despite the late hour. "Miss?" he prompted, looking up from a document he was studying. "Rose Kensington," she replied, extending her hand. "I was told to speak to you about Captain Thomas Sinclair." Alistair Finch took her hand, his grip surprisingly firm. "Ah, yes. The vanishing captain. Please sit down, Miss Kensington." He gestured towards a worn leather chair in front of the desk. Rose sat down, her heart pounding. She felt a strange sense of unease in this room, a feeling that she was stepping into a world far more complex and dangerous than she could have imagined. "The clerk downstairs tells me you received a telegram 2 years ago informing you of Captain Sinclair's death," Finch said, his eyes fixed on her face. "Yet, our records show no such notification." Rose recounted her story, her voice trembling slightly as she described the memorial, the vanishing name, the chilling realization that everything she had believed for the past 2 years might be a lie. Finch listened intently, his expression unchanging. He made no notes, asked no questions, simply absorbed her words like a sponge. When she had finished, he remained silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on a point somewhere beyond her shoulder. "Miss Kensington," he said finally, his voice low and measured, "I believe you." Rose blinked, surprised. She had expected skepticism, disbelief, perhaps even ridicule. But not this. "You do?" she asked, her voice filled with a mixture of relief and apprehension. "Yes," Finch said. "I've been investigating Captain Sinclair's case for some time now, and I've come to the conclusion that he is, or was involved in something far more complicated than a simple battlefield death." He leaned forward, his eyes locking with hers. "Something that certain people want to keep hidden." Rose felt a chill run down her spine. "Well, what kind of something?" Finch hesitated, as if weighing his words carefully. "Let's just say that Captain Sinclair was not just a soldier, Miss Kensington. He was a man of many talents. And some of those talents were utilized by the intelligence services." Rose's mind reeled. Thomas? A spy? It seemed impossible. The gentle, kind, bookish man she had loved involved in espionage? Yet, a part of her, a small, intuitive part, recognized the truth in Finch's words. There had always been something elusive about Thomas, a hidden depth she had never quite been able to penetrate. "And you think he might still be alive?" Rose asked, daring to voice the hope that had been flickering within her. Finch's expression softened slightly. "I don't know, Miss Kensington, but I intend to find out. And I believe you can help me." He reached into a drawer and pulled out a file, its cover marked with a single, ominous word. "Classified." "There are whispers, Miss Kensington, whispers I can't ignore." He paused, meeting her eyes. "And those whispers are getting louder." Chapter 3. The Unsent Letter. Finch opened the classified file, the rustle of the aged paper sounding loud in the otherwise silent room. Rose leaned forward, her gaze fixed on the documents within, a mixture of anticipation and dread churning in her stomach. The file was surprisingly thin, containing only a handful of pages, each stamped with various official seals and markings. "Captain Sinclair's official service record," Finch began, his voice low and measured, "is, as you discovered, incomplete. It ends abruptly in July 1916, with a note indicating he was transferred to a special assignment. There's no mention of his death, no casualty report, nothing." He pointed to a typed document, a brief summary of Sinclair's military career. Rose scanned the familiar details, his commission, his postings, his commendations for bravery. It all seemed so ordinary, so at odds with the image of a spy that Finch had painted. "But there are inconsistencies," Finch continued, his finger tapping a handwritten note attached to the official record. "This note, for instance, was added several months after his supposed transfer. It mentions a Project Nightingale, but there's no further explanation. No authorization, no details, nothing." Rose felt a prickle of unease. "Project Nightingale?" she repeated. "What does it mean?" Finch shook his head. "I don't know. It's a code name, obviously. But for what, I haven't been able to determine. My inquiries have been met with resistance. Stonewalling, you might call it." He then pulled out a photograph, a black and white image of a group of soldiers standing in front of a bombed-out building. Rose recognized Thomas instantly, even though he was younger, leaner, his face less lined with the weariness of war. He was smiling, his arm around the shoulder of another soldier. "This was taken in France, shortly before his disappearance," Finch said. "The man next to him is Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Davies. He was Sinclair's commanding officer and also, it seems, his handler." Rose stared at the photograph, her heart aching. Thomas looked so carefree, so full of life. It was hard to reconcile that image with the man she had last seen, the man who had left for the front lines with a haunted look in his eyes. "Davies is dead," Finch continued. "Killed in a training accident a few months after this picture was taken. Convenient, wouldn't you say?" Rose nodded, her mind racing. It was all starting to fit together, the pieces of a puzzle she hadn't even known existed. Thomas's disappearance, the vanishing name, the inconsistencies in his record, it all pointed to a deliberate cover-up. "There's one more thing," Finch said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. He reached into the file and pulled out a small, sealed envelope. It was addressed to Rose, in Thomas's familiar handwriting. Rose's breath caught in her throat. She recognized the script instantly. The slightly slanted letters, the distinctive way he crossed his T's. Her hands trembled as she reached for the envelope. This was found among Davies's personal effects, Finch explained. It was never sent. I suspect Davies intercepted it, or perhaps Thomas never intended to send it. Rose turned the envelope over in her hands. It was sealed with wax, bearing the imprint of a small, intricate crest, a nightingale perched on a branch. The same nightingale from the project name. Her heart pounded against her ribs. What secrets did this letter hold? What message had Thomas been trying to send her? She hesitated, her fingers hovering over the seal. A part of her was afraid to open it, afraid of what she might find. What if it confirmed her worst fears? What if it shattered the fragile hope that had been growing within her? "Open it, Miss Kensington," Finch said softly, his eyes filled with a mixture of encouragement and concern. "It's time you knew the truth." Rose took a deep breath and broke the seal. She carefully unfolded the letter, the paper crackling softly. The ink was faded, but the words were still legible. "My dearest Rose, if you are reading this, it means I am either dead or unable to contact you directly. I cannot explain the details of my current assignment, except to say that it is of the utmost importance, and involves a great deal of risk. I know this is vague, and I apologize for that, but I am bound by oaths I cannot break. There are things I have not told you, Rose, things I have kept hidden for your own protection. I have always tried to shield you from the darker aspects of my life, but now I fear that my silence may have put you in danger. If anything should happen to me, please know that I loved you, more than words can express. You were the light in my darkness, the anchor that kept me grounded in a world gone mad. I regret that I could not be the man you deserved, the man who could offer you a simple, peaceful life. There is a name I need you to remember, Alistair Finch. He is the only one you can trust. He knows some of what is going on. He may be able to help you. Forgive me, Rose. For everything. Yours always." Thomas Rose reread the letter several times, her tears blurring the ink. The words were both a confirmation of her fears and a testament to Thomas's love. He had been protecting her, even in his absence. He had known the risks, and he had faced them willingly, for a cause he believed in. But the letter also raised more questions than it answered. What was this special assignment? What dangers did it involve? And what had Thomas meant by "things I have not told you"? She looked up at Finch, her eyes filled with a mixture of grief, confusion, and a newfound determination. "He knew you," she said, her voice trembling. "He trusted you." Finch nodded. "We worked together briefly, before he was recruited for this mission. I was one of the few who knew his true identity, his true purpose." "And Project Nightingale?" Rose asked. "What is it?" Finch hesitated. I believe it involves a network of spies, operating within both the Allied and Central Powers. A network that Thomas was deeply embedded in." He looked at her, his expression grave. "And I believe someone within that network betrayed him." The air in the room seemed to crackle with tension. The unsent letter lay on the desk, a tangible link to a past that was suddenly, terrifyingly relevant. "We need to find out who," Rose said, her voice firm, her eyes blazing with a fierce determination. "And why?" She wouldn't rest. Not now. Not until Thomas had justice. And maybe, just maybe, not until she could find him. Chapter 4. A photograph torn in two. Finch leaned back in his chair, studying Rose with a mixture of admiration and concern. Her grief was palpable, yet it was tempered by a steely resolve that he found both impressive and unsettling. He knew the dangers that lay ahead, the powerful forces they would be confronting. He had to be certain she was prepared for what was to come. "Miss Kensington," he began, his voice cautious, "before we proceed any further, I need you to understand the gravity of this situation. We are dealing with matters of national security, with individuals who will stop at nothing to protect their secrets. This is not a game. Lives are at stake." Rose met his gaze unflinchingly. "I understand, Mr. Finch. I've seen the horrors of war firsthand. I've tended to the wounded and dying. I've witnessed the brutality and the senselessness of it all. I'm not afraid. Her voice was steady, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of fear, a fear she was determined to overcome.
Good, Finch said, nodding slowly.
Because the first thing we need to do is find out who had access to Captain Sinclair's file, who had the authority to alter his records, to make him disappear. He reached into a drawer and pulled out another photograph, this one smaller and more worn than the previous one. It showed Thomas, not in uniform this time, but in civilian clothes, standing in front of what looked like a country estate. He was smiling, but there was a certain guardedness in his eyes, a hint of the secrets he carried. This was taken at Blackwood Manor, Finch explained. It was a meeting place of sorts for individuals involved in sensitive operations. A place where secrets were exchanged, plans were made. Rose examined the photograph closely. There was something familiar about the setting, something that tugged at the edges of her memory. She couldn't quite place it. Do you recognize it? Finch asked, noticing her scrutiny. Rose shook her head. Not exactly. But there's something a feeling. Finch nodded. It's possible you may have seen it before. Captain Sinclair sometimes brought guests there. People he trusted, people he needed to consult with. He paused, then added, I believe Blackwood Manor holds the key to understanding what happened to him. I've been trying to gain access to the estate, but it's currently under the control of a rather influential family. The Ashworths. The name rang a bell. Rose had heard of the Ashworths. They were a prominent family, with deep connections to the government and the military. Whispers of their involvement in clandestine activities had circulated for years, but nothing had ever been proven. The Ashworths, Rose repeated, a sense of unease settling over her. They're known to be ruthless. Indeed, Finch agreed. And they have a vested interest in keeping certain secrets buried, especially secrets related to Project Nightingale. He then reached into the file again and pulled out another piece of the puzzle, a photograph, but this one had been deliberately torn in half. The jagged edges hinted at a violent act, a desperate attempt to conceal something. Rose gasped. It was the photograph from Finch's office, the one of Thomas and Lieutenant Colonel Davies. But this was only half of it, showing Thomas standing in front of the bombed-out building. Davies was gone, ripped away. This was found in Davies's personal belongings, along with the unsent letter, Finch explained. It's clear that someone wanted to remove Davies from the picture, to erase any connection between him and Sinclair. Rose took the torn photograph, her fingers tracing the outline of Thomas's face. The image was incomplete, fragmented, a metaphor for her own shattered memories. Who would do this?
And why?
I believe, Finch said, his voice low and intense, that the person who tore this photograph holds the key to Thomas's disappearance. They knew about Davies, they knew about Project Nightingale, and they wanted to silence them both. Rose looked at the torn photograph, then at Finch. A sudden, terrifying thought struck her. What if the person who tore the photograph was someone she knew? Someone she trusted? The implications were chilling. The war had created strange alliances, blurred the lines between friend and foe. Trust was a luxury no one could afford. We need to find the other half, Rose said, her voice barely a whisper. It might show us who was with them.
Who Davies was with.
Finch nodded. I agree. But finding it will be difficult. It could be anywhere. Hidden in a secret compartment, buried in a forgotten archive, or destroyed completely. He looked at Rose, his eyes filled with a mixture of determination and apprehension. We have a long and dangerous road ahead of us, Miss Kensington. Are you sure you're ready for this? Rose met his gaze, her own eyes reflecting a newfound resolve. She had come this far. She couldn't turn back now. She had to find the truth, for Thomas, for herself, and for all those who had been silenced by the war. She carefully placed the torn photograph in her handbag, next to the telegram and the unsent letter. These were her clues, her weapons in a battle she was only just beginning to understand. I'm ready, she said, her voice firm, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and anticipation. Let's start with Blackwood Manor. The sooner, the better. Before any more clues could be destroyed or people silenced. A cold determination solidified. She would see this through, no matter the cost. Chapter 5. The Secret of the Psalm. The journey to Blackwood Manor was fraught with a tense silence, broken only by the rhythmic chugging of the train and the occasional mournful whistle. Rose sat by the window, gazing out at the bleak, war-scarred landscape rushing past. The fields, once lush and green, were now pockmarked with shell craters, crisscrossed with trenches, and dotted with makeshift graveyards. The scars of the Somme were visible even here, miles away from the front lines, a constant reminder of the devastation and loss. Finch sat opposite her, poring over a stack of documents, his brow furrowed in concentration. He had been unusually quiet since they left London, lost in his own thoughts, his own calculations. Rose knew he was worried, not just about the dangers they faced, but also about her. He had seen firsthand the brutality of the war, the toll it took on even the strongest of individuals. He didn't want her to become another casualty. But Rose was determined. She had to see this through, not just for Thomas, but for herself. She needed to know the truth, to understand what had happened to him, to find some semblance of peace in a world that had been turned upside down. As the train pulled into the small, rural station nearest to Blackwood Manor, Rose felt a knot of apprehension tighten in her stomach. This was it. The beginning of their investigation, the first step into a world of secrets and lies. They hired a local car, a battered old Ford, to take them the remaining few miles to the estate. The driver, a taciturn old man with weathered hands and knowing eyes, seemed to sense their unease. He said little, but Rose caught him watching them in the rearview mirror, his gaze filled with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. The drive was along a winding, country lane, lined with ancient oaks and towering hedgerows. The air was crisp and clean, a stark contrast to the smoky, congested streets of London. But even here, the war had left its mark. Rose noticed the absence of young men, the fields untended, the houses shuttered and silent. As they approached the manor, Rose gasped. It was even more imposing than she had imagined. A sprawling, Gothic structure of gray stone, with turrets and towers and sprawling wings, it loomed over the landscape like a brooding sentinel. The grounds were vast and meticulously maintained, with manicured lawns, formal gardens, and a long, winding driveway leading to the imposing front entrance. It was then that Rose remembered where she had seen it before. In a dream. A recurring dream she'd had ever since receiving the telegram. A dream of Thomas, standing in front of this very manor, beckoning her to follow him. But in the dream, the manor was always shrouded in mist, and Thomas's face was obscured, his voice a distant whisper. "Are you all right, Miss Kensington?" Finch asked, noticing her sudden pallor. Rose shook her head, trying to dispel the unsettling feeling that had washed over her. "Just a memory," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "A dream, I think." Finch nodded, understanding. He knew the power of dreams, the way they could unlock hidden memories, reveal buried truths. He had seen it many times before in his line of work. They arrived at the front entrance, the car crunching on the gravel driveway. A liveried footman emerged from the house, his expression impassive. He approached the car, his gaze fixed on Finch. "Mr. Finch, I presume?" he said, his voice formal and slightly condescending. "And Miss Kensington," Rose supplied, stepping out of the car. She straightened her coat, trying to project an air of confidence, despite the tremor in her hands. "Lady Ashworth is expecting you," the footman said. "Please follow me." They were led into a vast, opulent entrance hall, dominated by a grand staircase and a massive crystal chandelier. The walls were adorned with portraits of stern-faced ancestors, their eyes seeming to follow Rose as she walked. The air was heavy with the scent of old money, polish, and something else, something indefinable, something unsettling. The footman led them through a series of long corridors and ornate drawing rooms, each more lavishly decorated than the last. Rose felt a growing sense of unease, a feeling that she was being watched, scrutinized. Finally, they arrived at a large, oak-paneled study. The footman knocked softly, then opened the door and announced them. Mr. Finch and Miss Kensington, my lady. Lady Ashworth was seated behind a large, mahogany desk, her back to the window. She was an imposing figure, tall and slender, with silver hair piled high on her head and piercing blue eyes that seemed to see right through Rose. She was dressed in a severe black gown, adorned with a single strand of pearls. Mr. Finch, she said, her voice cold and crisp. And Miss Kensington, you wish to speak to me about? She raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow, a silent challenge. Captain Thomas Sinclair, Finch replied, his voice equally measured. We believe he may have been a guest at Blackwood Manor some time ago. Lady Ashworth's expression did not change, but Rose noticed a slight tightening of her lips, a subtle flicker of something in her eyes. Captain Sinclair? She repeated, her voice carefully neutral. I'm afraid I don't recall the name. Finch stepped forward, placing the torn photograph on the desk. Perhaps this will refresh your memory, Lady Ashworth. This was taken at Blackwood Manor. Captain Sinclair is, or was a friend of Lieutenant Colonel Davies. Lady Ashworth glanced at the photograph, her eyes narrowing slightly. She picked it up, her fingers tracing the torn edge. I see, she said slowly. And what, exactly, is your interest in Captain Sinclair? We believe he may have been involved in sensitive matters, Finch replied. Matters that may be connected to his disappearance. Disappearance? Lady Ashworth raised an eyebrow again. I was under the impression that Captain Sinclair was killed in action. At the Somme. That's what the official record said, Rose interjected, her voice stronger now, fueled by a growing sense of anger. But those records are incomplete. And his name vanished from a war memorial. Lady Ashworth looked at Rose for the first time, her gaze assessing, calculating. Indeed, she said softly. A most unusual occurrence. But I'm afraid I can't help you. I have no knowledge of Captain Sinclair or his disappearance. She placed the torn photograph back on the desk, her hand lingering on it for a moment. However, she added, her voice taking on a slightly different tone, I do recall a project that Lieutenant Colonel Davies was involved in. Something called Nightingale. She looked directly at Rose, and the air grew still. Does that ring a bell? Chapter 6. Beneath a Flanders Moon. Rose's breath hitched. Lady Ashworth's deliberate mention of Nightingale, the code name that had haunted her since Finch revealed it, felt like a calculated move, a subtle probing of her knowledge and intentions. The air in the study thickened with unspoken tension, the silence punctuated only by the ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. It does, Rose admitted, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. She met Lady Ashworth's gaze, refusing to be intimidated by the older woman's scrutiny. We believe it's connected to Captain Sinclair's disappearance. Lady Ashworth leaned back in her chair, her fingers steepled beneath her chin. A faint, almost imperceptible smile played on her lips. Indeed, Project Nightingale was a delicate matter. A matter of national security. I'm afraid I'm not at liberty to discuss it. But Captain Sinclair was involved. Finch pressed, his voice firm. And he may be alive. We need your help to find him. Lady Ashworth's smile vanished. Mr. Finch, I understand your concern, and Miss Kensington's grief. But I assure you, Captain Sinclair is not here. And I have no information that would be of use to you. Rose felt a surge of frustration. Lady Ashworth was clearly hiding something, playing a carefully orchestrated game of denial. But Rose was not about to be deterred. She had come too far, faced too much, to be turned away by the woman's evasiveness. With all due respect, Lady Ashworth, Rose said, her voice rising slightly, we believe you do. You knew about Project Nightingale. You knew about Lieutenant Colonel Davies. And you knew about Captain Sinclair's presence at Blackwood Manor. She paused, her gaze unwavering. We're not leaving until we get some answers. Lady Ashworth's eyes narrowed. She studied Rose for a long moment, as if assessing her resolve. Then, she sighed, a sound that conveyed a mixture of resignation and something else. Something that sounded almost like regret. Very well, Miss Kensington, she said, her voice softening slightly. I will tell you what I know. But I must warn you, it may not be what you want to hear. She rose from her chair and walked over to a large window that overlooked the manicured gardens. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the lawn. The sky was a fiery canvas of orange and purple, a breathtaking display of beauty that contrasted sharply with the darkness of the secrets being revealed within the study. Project Nightingale, Lady Ashworth began, her voice low and measured, was a clandestine operation designed to infiltrate the German intelligence network. It involved recruiting individuals with unique skills, individuals who could move freely between both sides of the conflict, gathering information, sabotaging enemy operations. Rose listened intently, her heart pounding. This was it. The truth she had been seeking. The truth about Thomas's secret life. Captain Sinclair, Lady Ashworth continued, was one of our most valuable assets. He was fluent in German, he had a photographic memory, and he was incredibly charming. He could gain the trust of anyone. She paused, her gaze fixed on the distant horizon. He infiltrated a high-ranking German officer's staff, posing as a sympathizer. He gained access to crucial information that helped us win several key battles. Rose felt a wave of conflicting emotions wash over her. Pride in Thomas's bravery, fear for his safety, and a deep sense of betrayal. He had kept this from her, hidden this entire side of his life. But something went wrong, Lady Ashworth said, her voice turning cold again. Someone betrayed him. Someone within Project Nightingale. Rose's breath caught in her throat. Who? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Lady Ashworth turned back to face her, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and guilt. I don't know, she said. But I believe it was someone close to him. Someone he trusted. She walked over to a small, antique cabinet and opened it, revealing a collection of crystal decanters and glasses. She poured herself a generous measure of brandy and took a long sip. The information Captain Sinclair was gathering, it was highly sensitive, she continued. It involved a planned German offensive, a massive attack that would have broken through our lines and potentially changed the course of the war. Rose remembered the telegram, the stark message informing her of Thomas's death at the Somme. The Somme, the site of one of the bloodiest battles in history. The Somme, Rose whispered, her voice trembling. Was that the planned offensive? Lady Ashworth nodded. Yes. Captain Sinclair's information allowed us to prepare, to reinforce our defenses. But it came at a cost. She paused, her gaze meeting Rose's. The Germans discovered his true identity. They captured him. And they tortured him. For information. Rose felt a cold hand grip her heart. She had imagined Thomas dying a quick, clean death on the battlefield. But this was a nightmare. But the telegram, Rose stammered. It said he was killed in action. Lady Ashworth shook her head. That was a lie. A necessary lie, to protect the other members of Project Nightingale. To prevent the Germans from discovering the extent of our intelligence network. But why tell me now? Rose asked, her voice filled with confusion and anger. Why keep it a secret for so long? Lady Ashworth looked at her, her expression softening again. Because I believe you deserve to know the truth. And because I believe Captain Sinclair may still be alive. She took another sip of brandy, her hand trembling slightly. There were rumors. Whispers from the front lines. Stories of a British officer, held captive by the Germans, subjected to unspeakable horrors, but surviving. She placed the glass down on the desk, the sound echoing in the silence. I dismissed them at first, as wishful thinking, the desperate hopes of grieving soldiers. But then I saw this. She reached into a drawer and pulled out a small, faded photograph. It was a picture of Thomas, taken during his time in Flanders. He was standing beneath a full moon, his face illuminated by the soft, silvery light. He was smiling, but there was a sadness in his eyes, a haunting quality that sent a shiver down Rose's spine. On the back of the photograph, in Thomas's handwriting, were 2 words, still hoping. And then she understood. Everything. Lady Ashworth turned away. Leave now, she said, her voice choked with a sudden rush of emotion. And pray you never find him. Chapter 7. The Rendezvous at Amiens. Lady Ashworth's words, "Leave now, and pray you never find him," echoed in Rose's mind, a chilling counterpoint to the fragile hope sparked by the photograph and the inscription, "Still hoping." The journey back to London was a blur of conflicting emotions, relief at finally knowing a part of the truth, fear of what the full truth might reveal, and a growing determination to find Thomas, no matter the cost. Finch, sensing her turmoil, remained mostly silent, offering only occasional words of comfort and reassurance. He knew that Rose needed time to process the information, to come to terms with the reality of Thomas's situation. He also knew that their investigation had just taken a dangerous turn. Lady Ashworth's revelation had opened up new avenues of inquiry, but it had also exposed them to greater risks. Once back in London, Rose insisted on going straight to her flat, needing the solitude and familiarity of her own space to gather her thoughts. Finch, understanding her need, agreed to meet her the following morning at his office. The flat felt strangely empty, devoid of the warmth and comfort it had once held. The silence was deafening, amplifying the echoes of the past, the memories of Thomas that now seemed tinged with a new layer of complexity and pain. Rose went through her usual evening routine, but her heart wasn't in it. She made a cup of tea, but it remained untouched, growing cold on the table. She sat in her armchair, staring at the faded photograph of Thomas beneath the Flanders moon. The image haunted her. His smile, the sadness in his eyes, the inscription, it all spoke of a man enduring unspeakable horrors, yet clinging to a flicker of hope. A hope that she now shared, a hope that fueled her determination to find him. She reread Thomas's unsent letter, his words taking on a new meaning in light of Lady Ashworth's revelations. He had been protecting her, shielding her from the dangers of his secret life. But his silence had also left her vulnerable, unprepared for the truth. And the truth was far more complicated than she had ever imagined. Thomas wasn't just a soldier, he was a spy. He had infiltrated the enemy's ranks, risked his life for his country, and been betrayed by someone he trusted. The thought of that betrayal sent a fresh wave of anger through her. Who had done this to him? Who had condemned him to such a fate?
And why?
Rose knew that she couldn't rest until she had answers. She had to find the person responsible, to expose their treachery, to bring them to justice. And she had to find Thomas, to rescue him from whatever hell he was enduring. The next morning, Rose arrived at Finch's office, her mind racing with possibilities. She had spent a restless night, piecing together the fragments of information, formulating a plan of action. Finch greeted her with a concerned look. "How are you holding up, Miss Kensington?" "I'm determined," Rose replied, her voice firm. "We need to find out who betrayed Thomas. And we need to find out where he is being held." Finch nodded. "I agree. I've been doing some digging. Lady Ashworth's information about the planned German offensive at the Somme checks out. There was a significant intelligence leak, one that nearly cost us the battle." He pulled out a map of France, spreading it across his desk. He pointed to a specific location, a small town near the front lines. "Amiens," he said. "This is where the German officer Thomas was spying on was stationed. It's also where the rumors of a captured British officer originated." Rose leaned closer, her gaze fixed on the map. Amiens, the name resonated with a sense of dread, a feeling that she was getting closer to the truth, but also closer to danger. "I think," Finch continued, "that we need to go to Amiens, to investigate these rumors, to see if we can find any trace of Thomas." Rose nodded. "I agree. But we need to be careful. We don't know who we can trust." Finch reached into a drawer and pulled out a small, leather-bound notebook. "I have a contact in Amiens," he said. "A former colleague. Someone who owes me a favor." He flipped through the notebook, stopping at a page with a name and an address. "Madeleine Dubois," he said. "She runs a discreet establishment. A place where information is exchanged, secrets are bought and sold." Rose raised an eyebrow. "A brothel?" Finch smiled faintly. "Let's just say it's a place where people feel comfortable talking. Madeleine is a shrewd woman, with a network of contacts that spans both sides of the conflict. She may be able to help us." He looked at Rose, his eyes serious. "But it's dangerous, Miss Kensington. Amiens is a war zone. The Germans are still there, and they're not known for their hospitality. Rose met his gaze unflinchingly. I'm not afraid, Mr. Finch. I'm going to Amiens. With or without you. Finch sighed. He knew he couldn't dissuade her. He had seen that look in her eyes, the same look he had seen in the eyes of countless soldiers heading into battle. A look of determination, of courage, of a willingness to face whatever lay ahead. Very well, Miss Kensington, he said. We'll go to Amiens. Together. He paused. I have arranged a rendezvous with Madeline. Tomorrow night. He looked at her, his expression grave. Be ready. He didn't need to say for what. She already knew. Chapter 8. The Spy Among Us. The train to Dover was packed with soldiers, nurses, and civilians, all caught in the chaotic currents of the impending armistice. The air was thick with a mixture of anticipation, relief, and a lingering sense of dread. The war was ending, but the scars it had left would remain for generations. Rose and Finch sat in a cramped compartment, surrounded by the murmur of conversations, the clatter of luggage, and the rhythmic chugging of the train. They spoke little, each lost in their own thoughts, their own preparations for the dangerous journey ahead. Rose had spent the day gathering supplies, packing a small bag with essentials, a change of clothes, a first aid kit, a map of Amiens, and the faded photograph of Thomas beneath the Flanders moon. She had also secured a small, discreet pistol, a gift from a former colleague at St. Bartholomew's, a reminder of the harsh realities of the world they were entering. Finch had been busy making arrangements, securing travel documents, exchanging coded messages with his contact in Amiens, and gathering information about the current situation in the town. He had also obtained a detailed map of the German fortifications and a list of suspected collaborators. As the train neared Dover, Rose felt a growing sense of unease. She knew that they were stepping into a world of shadows and deception, where trust was a rare commodity and betrayal was a constant threat. They crossed the channel on a crowded ferry, the gray waters choppy and turbulent, mirroring the turmoil in Rose's heart. The air was cold and damp, the cries of the seagulls a mournful soundtrack to their journey. From Calais, they took another train, this one even more crowded and chaotic than the first. The journey was long and arduous, the landscape bleak and war-torn. Rose saw the devastation firsthand, bombed-out villages, shattered forests, fields scarred with trenches and barbed wire. As they approached Amiens, Rose felt a knot of apprehension tighten in her stomach. The town was under German occupation, a dangerous place for a British citizen, especially one investigating a sensitive case. They arrived at the Amiens station late in the evening, the platform shrouded in darkness and a tense silence. The air was thick with the smell of smoke, gunpowder, and the faint, lingering scent of death. Finch led Rose through the deserted streets, their footsteps echoing in the stillness. The town was eerily quiet, the houses shuttered and dark, the only sign of life the occasional German patrol, their footsteps heavy and menacing. They reached their destination, a narrow, nondescript building in a dimly lit alleyway. A single red lantern hung above the door, casting a faint, crimson glow. The sign above the door read, Le Chat Noir. Finch knocked on the door in a specific pattern, a coded signal that he had arranged with Madeline. After a moment, the door opened a crack, revealing a wary eye.
Madeline?
Finch asked, his voice low. The eye scrutinized them for a moment, then the door opened wider, revealing a woman in her late 30s, with dark hair, sharp eyes, and a world-weary expression. She was dressed in a simple, black dress, but there was a certain elegance about her, a hint of defiance in her stance. Alistair, she said, her voice husky and accented. You made it. And this? Rose Kensington, Finch replied. She's with me. Madeline nodded, her gaze assessing Rose with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion.
Come in, she said. Quickly.
They stepped inside, and Madeline closed and bolted the door behind them. The interior of Le Chat Noir was surprisingly cozy and intimate, a stark contrast to the bleakness of the streets outside. The air was warm and fragrant, with the scent of incense and something sweet and intoxicating. The main room was dimly lit, with red velvet curtains, plush armchairs, and small, round tables. A few couples were scattered around the room, whispering softly, their faces hidden in the shadows. Madeline led them to a private room at the back, a smaller, more secluded space with a single table and 2 chairs. She closed the door behind them, muffling the sounds from the main room. "So," she said, her voice low and direct. "You're looking for a ghost. A British officer, captured by the Germans." Finch nodded. "Captain Thomas Sinclair. We believe he was involved in Project Nightingale." Madeline's eyes widened slightly. "Nightingale," she repeated, her voice barely a whisper. "That's a dangerous name to be throwing around, Alistair. Especially in Amiens." "We know the risks," Finch replied. "But we believe Sinclair may still be alive. And we need your help to find him." Madeline studied them for a moment, her gaze intense. "I've heard the rumors," she said. "Whispers of a British officer, held captive in a secret location. A man who knows too much. Can you confirm those rumors?" Rose asked, her voice trembling slightly. Madeline hesitated. "Perhaps," she said. "But it will cost you. Information is a valuable commodity in this town. Especially information about Nightingale." "We're prepared to pay," Finch said. "Within reason." Madeline smiled faintly. "Reason is a relative term, Alistair. Especially in times of war." She paused, then added, "But I'm not just interested in money. I need a favor." "What kind of favor?" Finch asked, his voice cautious. Madeline leaned closer, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "There's a German officer," she said.
Major Heinrich Schmidt.
"He's a regular here. He's also involved in the local intelligence network." She paused, her gaze meeting Rose's. "He has a weakness for young women, especially women who remind him of someone he lost." She looked pointedly at Rose. "I want you," she said, her voice low and intense, "to get close to him, to gain his trust, to find out what he knows about the British officer." Rose felt a chill run down her spine. This was more dangerous than she had anticipated. She was being asked to play the role of a spy, to deceive a German officer, to risk her life for information. She looked at Finch, seeking his guidance, his reassurance. Finch's expression was grave. He knew the risks, but he also knew that this might be their only chance to find Thomas. He placed a hand on Rose's arm, his touch reassuring. "It's your decision, Miss Kensington," he said softly. "But we may not have another opportunity." Rose took a deep breath, steeling herself. She had come this far. She couldn't turn back now. She had to do whatever it took to find Thomas, to bring him home. She looked at Madeline, her eyes filled with a newfound resolve. "I'll do it," she said, her voice firm. "But I need your help. I need to know everything about Schmidt. His habits, his weaknesses, his secrets." Madeline smiled, a genuine smile this time, a smile that revealed a hint of admiration. "Very well, Miss Kensington," she said. "Welcome to the game." She leaned in close, her voice almost a whisper. "But be careful. There's a spy among us. And I don't mean Schmidt." Chapter 9. Betrayal in the Wards. Madeline's warning, "There's a spy among us," hung in the air, a chilling undercurrent to the already dangerous game Rose was about to play. The revelation cast a shadow of suspicion over everyone they had encountered, even Finch, although Rose instinctively dismissed that thought. But who, then? Lady Ashworth? One of Madeline's other contacts? Or someone they hadn't even met yet? The next few days were a whirlwind of preparation. Madeline provided Rose with a new identity. Isabelle Dubois, a distant cousin from Paris, seeking refuge in Amiens after her family's home was destroyed. She coached Rose on her backstory, her accent, her mannerisms, transforming her from a grieving Englishwoman into a seemingly carefree, slightly naive Frenchwoman. Madeline also provided Rose with information about Major Schmidt. He was a career officer, known for his ruthlessness and his efficiency. He was also a widower, his wife having died several years earlier from a sudden illness. He frequented Le Chat Noir regularly, seeking solace in the company of young women who reminded him of his lost love. Rose studied photographs of Schmidt, memorizing his features, his expressions, his mannerisms. She practiced her French, perfecting her accent, her vocabulary, her intonation. She learned to flirt, to charm, to deceive, skills that were utterly foreign to her, but now essential for her survival. Finch, meanwhile, worked with Madeline to gather information about the local German intelligence network, trying to identify potential sources, potential leads to Thomas's whereabouts. He also investigated the rumors of a secret prison, a place where high-value prisoners were held and interrogated. The first meeting with Schmidt was carefully orchestrated. Rose, dressed in a borrowed dress, a simple but elegant gown that accentuated her figure, sat at a table in the main room of Le Chat Noir, sipping a glass of wine and pretending to read a book. She was nervous, her heart pounding against her ribs, but she maintained a facade of composure, of nonchalance. Schmidt arrived shortly after, accompanied by 2 other officers. He was taller than Rose had expected, with a stern face, piercing blue eyes, and a military bearing that exuded authority. He scanned the room, his gaze lingering on Rose for a moment, a flicker of interest in his eyes. Madeline, playing the role of the concerned proprietor, approached Schmidt and, after a brief conversation, subtly directed him towards Rose's table. Schmidt dismissed his companions and approached Rose, his footsteps measured and deliberate. "Mademoiselle Dubois?" he asked, his voice surprisingly gentle, his German accent thick but understandable. Rose looked up, feigning surprise.
Oui, monsieur?
She replied, her voice soft, her French accent carefully cultivated. "May I join you?" he asked, gesturing towards the empty chair at her table. Rose hesitated for a moment, as if considering his request, then smiled faintly. "Of course, monsieur." Schmidt sat down, his gaze fixed on her face. He introduced himself, and Rose responded in kind, playing the role of the shy, slightly overwhelmed young woman. They engaged in small talk, carefully orchestrated by Rose, who steered the conversation towards topics that might reveal information about Schmidt's work, his personal life, his vulnerabilities. She learned that he was indeed lonely, haunted by the memory of his wife. She learned that he was frustrated by the slow progress of the war, by the growing resistance of the local population. She learned that he was ambitious, eager to prove himself to his superiors. And she learned that he was suspicious. He questioned her closely about her background, her family, her reasons for being in Amiens. He tested her French, her knowledge of Paris, her familiarity with French customs. Rose parried his questions with a mixture of truth and carefully crafted lies, drawing on the details of her own life, but twisting them to fit her new identity. She played the role of the innocent, the naive, the vulnerable young woman, appealing to his protective instincts, his loneliness, his desire for companionship. It was a dangerous game, a delicate dance of deception and seduction. One wrong move, one slip of the tongue, one flicker of doubt in her eyes, could expose her, could lead to her arrest, her imprisonment, or worse. Over the next few days, Rose met with Schmidt several times, each encounter carefully planned and executed. She gradually gained his trust, his confidence, his affection. He began to open up to her, revealing details about his work, his frustrations, his fears. She learned that he was indeed involved in the local intelligence network, that he was responsible for tracking down spies and resistance fighters. She learned that he had heard the rumors of a captured British officer, but he dismissed them as propaganda. But Rose sensed that he was hiding something, that he knew more than he was letting on. She noticed his subtle hesitations, his evasive answers, his guarded expressions. One evening, during a particularly intimate conversation, Rose decided to take a risk. She steered the conversation towards the topic of prisoners of war, expressing her sympathy for the captured soldiers, her concern for their well-being. Schmidt's expression hardened. "War is war, mademoiselle," he said, his voice cold. "There are no rules, only victory and defeat." "But surely," Rose persisted, her voice soft, her eyes filled with a feigned innocence, "there are limits. Surely, even in war, there must be humanity." Schmidt looked at her for a long moment, his gaze intense. Then, he sighed, a sound that conveyed a mixture of weariness and regret. "There are exceptions," he admitted, his voice low. "Special cases. Prisoners who possess valuable information. Rose's heart pounded. This was it. The opening she had been waiting for. And where are these special cases held? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Schmidt hesitated, his eyes searching her face. He seemed to be struggling with something, torn between his duty and his feelings for her. Then, he leaned closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. There's a place, he said. A sanatorium. Outside of town. It's called Les Ames Perdues. The Lost Souls. Rose felt a chill run down her spine.
Les âmes perdues.
The name itself was ominous, a chilling premonition of what she might find there. Suddenly, a commotion erupted in the main room. Shouts, screams, the sound of breaking glass. Schmidt stood up abruptly, his hand instinctively reaching for the pistol at his side. Stay here, he ordered, his voice sharp. It's not safe. He rushed out of the room, leaving Rose alone in the silence. She listened intently, trying to decipher the sounds from the main room. It sounded like a fight, a brawl, but she couldn't be sure. Then, she heard a familiar voice, raised in anger. Finch's voice. Rose's heart leaped into her throat. What was Finch doing? Had he been discovered? Had he been betrayed? She hesitated for a moment, torn between her mission and her concern for Finch. But she knew she couldn't stay here. She had to know what was happening. She cautiously opened the door and peered into the main room. She saw Finch, struggling with 2 German soldiers, his face bruised and bloodied. Madeline was standing nearby, her expression a mixture of fear and something else. Something that looked like guilt. And then Rose saw him. A man standing in the shadows, watching the scene unfold with a cold, detached expression. A man she recognized. A man she had trusted. Alistair Finch's assistant from London. The quiet, unassuming man who had helped them with their research, who had access to all their information, who had known their every move. The spy among them. And it became devastatingly clear, he had sold them out. And now they were all going to pay the price. Chapter 10. Echoes of a Lost Waltz. Rose's mind reeled. Finch's assistant, the man they had trusted implicitly, was a traitor. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow, leaving her breathless and disoriented. The implications were staggering. He had known their plans, their contacts, their every move. He had betrayed them to the Germans, and now Finch was paying the price. But there was no time for shock, for grief, for anger. She had to act, and act quickly. She ducked back into the private room, her mind racing, searching for a way out, a way to save Finch, a way to salvage their mission. She grabbed the small pistol she had hidden in her bag, her hand trembling slightly as she checked the chamber. It was a small weapon, a last resort, but it was all she had. She cautiously opened the door again, peering into the main room. The scene had changed. Finch was now on the floor, bleeding and unconscious, the 2 German soldiers standing over him. Madeline was nowhere to be seen, and the assistant was gone. Rose knew she couldn't take on the soldiers directly. She was outnumbered, outgunned. She had to find another way, a way to create a distraction, a way to buy Finch some time. Her gaze fell upon a small, ornate music box on a nearby table. It was a beautiful piece, inlaid with mother-of-pearl and silver. She remembered Schmidt telling her that it had belonged to his wife, that it played her favorite waltz. An idea sparked in her mind, a desperate gamble, but it was all she had. She grabbed the music box, her fingers fumbling with the delicate latch. She opened it, and a haunting melody filled the room, a sweet, melancholic waltz that echoed the sadness and the loss of the war. The sound startled the soldiers. They turned towards the music box, their expressions a mixture of confusion and surprise. Rose seized the opportunity. She stepped out of the room, her pistol raised, her voice clear and steady. "Drop your weapons," she ordered, her French accent gone, replaced by the crisp, authoritative tone of a British officer. The soldiers hesitated, their eyes widening in disbelief. They looked at Rose, then at the music box, then back at Rose. They were clearly confused, uncertain how to react. "I said, drop your weapons," Rose repeated, her voice unwavering. or I will shoot. She knew she couldn't hold them off for long. But she had to buy Finch some time for him to recover, time for them to escape. Suddenly, one of the soldiers lunged at her, his hand reaching for his own weapon. Rose reacted instantly, firing the pistol. The shot rang out, echoing through the room. The soldier stumbled, clutching his arm, his face contorted in pain. The other soldier hesitated, his eyes flickering between Rose and his wounded comrade. He seemed to be weighing his options, calculating his chances. Then he made his decision. He dropped his weapon, his hands raised in surrender. Rose kept her pistol trained on him, her eyes scanning the room, searching for any other threats. She saw Madeline, emerging from a back room, her expression a mixture of relief and shame. "Get Finch out of here," Rose ordered, her voice sharp.
Now.
Madeline nodded, her eyes filled with a newfound respect. She rushed over to Finch, helping him to his feet. He was dazed and bleeding, but he was conscious. "Rose," he mumbled, his voice weak.
What?
"No time to explain," Rose said, her voice urgent. "We have to go."
Now.
They supported Finch between them, making their way towards the back exit, the haunting melody of the waltz still echoing in the air. Rose kept her pistol trained on the two soldiers, her eyes constantly scanning the room, her senses on high alert. They reached the back door, and Madeline quickly unbolted it. They slipped out into the dark alleyway, the cool night air a welcome relief from the stifling tension of Le Chat Noir. They hurried through the winding streets, their footsteps echoing in the stillness. They didn't stop until they reached a safe house, a small, nondescript apartment that Madeline had arranged for them. Once inside, Rose helped Finch to a chair, her hands trembling as she examined his injuries. He had a deep cut on his forehead, a bruised jaw, and several cuts and bruises on his body. But he was alive. Rose cleaned and bandaged his wounds, her hands surprisingly steady, her medical training kicking in. She worked quickly and efficiently, her mind focused on the task at hand. As she worked, Finch slowly regained his composure. He looked at Rose, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and amazement. "You saved me, Rose," he said, his voice weak but sincere. "You were incredible." Rose smiled faintly, her eyes filled with tears. "We saved each other," she said. "We're a team." But even as she said the words, she knew that things had changed. The betrayal of Finch's assistant had shattered their trust, their sense of security. They were alone now, in a dangerous and unfamiliar world, with no one to rely on but each other. The music box lay discarded on a table, its lid closed, the faint inscription and Elise scratched into its surface. The melody had stopped, but its echo remained, a haunting reminder of the night's events and the betrayal that had almost cost them everything. Outside, the first sirens of the German patrol could be heard, closing in. The respite was over. Chapter 11. The Price of Silence. The sound of approaching sirens shattered the fragile calm of the safe house, jolting Rose and Finch back into the harsh reality of their situation. They were fugitives, hunted by the Germans, betrayed by someone they had trusted. Their mission to find Thomas had become even more perilous, their chances of success even slimmer. "We have to move," Rose said, her voice urgent. "They'll be searching every house, every building." Finch nodded, his face grim. He was still weak and dazed, but his determination remained unbroken. "Madeline, can she help us?" Rose hesitated. Madeline had helped them escape, but she had also been strangely hesitant, her eyes filled with a mixture of guilt and fear when she saw Finch's assistant. Could they truly trust her? "I don't know," Rose admitted. "But we have no other choice. We need to get out of Amiens, to find a safe place to regroup." They quickly gathered their meager belongings, Rose stuffing the faded photograph of Thomas into her bag, a tangible reminder of their ultimate goal. They slipped out the back door of the safe house, melting into the labyrinthine alleyways of Amiens. The streets were deserted, the town holding its breath under the oppressive weight of the German occupation. The sirens were getting closer, their wailing a constant reminder of the imminent danger. They made their way towards the outskirts of town, avoiding the main roads, sticking to the shadows, their senses on high alert. They knew that every corner, every doorway, every darkened window could conceal a threat. As they neared the edge of town, they heard the sound of approaching footsteps, heavy and deliberate. A German patrol. They ducked into a narrow alleyway, pressing themselves against the cold, damp wall, holding their breath, praying that they wouldn't be seen. The patrol passed by, their voices harsh and guttural, their footsteps echoing in the silence. Rose and Finch remained frozen, their hearts pounding, until the sound of the patrol faded away. They continued their flight, making their way through fields, across ditches, along deserted country lanes. The landscape was bleak and desolate, mirroring the despair that threatened to engulf them. Finally, as dawn began to break, they reached a small, abandoned farmhouse, its windows boarded up, its roof partially collapsed. It was a desolate, unwelcoming place, but it offered a semblance of shelter, a place to rest, to plan their next move. They slipped inside, the air thick with the smell of dust, decay, and damp earth. They found a relatively dry corner, collapsing onto the floor, exhausted and dispirited. Finch leaned against the wall, his eyes closed, his face pale and drawn. Rose sat beside him, her hand resting on his arm, offering a silent reassurance. "We'll figure this out, Finch," she said, her voice soft but firm. "We always do." Finch opened his eyes, looking at her with a mixture of gratitude and doubt. "I don't know, Rose," he said, his voice weak. This is different. We've been betrayed. We're alone. And we're running out of time." Rose knew he was right. The betrayal of Finch's assistant had dealt a devastating blow to their mission. It had exposed them to greater dangers, it had shattered their trust, and it had left them with few resources. But Rose refused to give up. She had come too far, faced too much, to be defeated now. She had to find Thomas, to rescue him from whatever hell he was enduring. And she had to bring the traitor to justice. "We need to find out why," Rose said, her voice determined. "Why he betrayed us. Who he was working for." Finch nodded. "And we need to find out what Schmidt knows."
About les âmes perdues.
Rose remembered the name, the chilling designation of the sanatorium where Thomas might be held. The Lost Souls. It was a place of despair, of suffering, of secrets. "We need to get to that sanatorium," Rose said. "To see if Thomas is there. To rescue him." But how? They were fugitives, hunted by the Germans, with no resources, no contacts, no plan. Suddenly, Rose remembered something. Something Madeline had said, a seemingly insignificant detail, but one that now took on a new significance. "Madeline," Rose said, her voice thoughtful. She said Schmidt had a weakness for women who reminded him of his wife. Finch looked at her, his eyes questioning. "And she gave me this," Rose continued, reaching into her bag and pulling out a small, velvet pouch. She opened it, revealing a delicate, silver locket. Rose opened the locket. Inside there were 2 miniature portraits. One was of Schmidt, younger and less hardened. The other was of a beautiful woman with dark hair and gentle eyes. Schmidt's wife. Madeline said this belonged to Schmidt's wife, Rose explained. She said he carries it with him always, a reminder of his loss. Finch examined the locket, his brow furrowed in concentration. "And you think?" "I think," Rose said, her voice firm, "that this locket might be our key. To getting close to Schmidt again. To gaining his trust. To finding out where Thomas is." It was a long shot, a desperate gamble, but it was all they had. Rose knew that she would have to play the role of Schmidt's lost love once again, to deceive him, to manipulate him, to risk her own safety for a chance to save Thomas. "It's dangerous, Rose," Finch said, his voice filled with concern. "Too dangerous." Rose met his gaze, her eyes unwavering. "I know," she said, "but I'm not afraid. I have to do this. For Thomas." She closed the locket, the silver cool against her palm. It was a symbol of love, of loss, of hope. And it was now her weapon, her shield, in a battle she was determined to win. The price of silence, she knew, was too high. And she was willing to pay whatever price was necessary to break that silence and find the truth. A cold determination settled over her. She would use Schmidt's weakness. It was the only way. Chapter 12. A Promise by the Thames. The plan was audacious, bordering on reckless. Rose would use the locket, the tangible symbol of Schmidt's lost love, to re-establish contact with him, to regain his trust, and to ultimately discover the location of Les Ames Perdue's. Finch, still recovering from his injuries, would remain hidden at the farmhouse, providing what support he could from a distance. Rose knew the risks. She was walking into a trap, deliberately placing herself in the hands of a dangerous enemy. But she had no other choice. Time was running out, and Thomas's life hung in the balance. She spent the next few days preparing, mentally and physically. She studied the portrait of Schmidt's wife, memorizing her features, her expression, her demeanor. She practiced her French, refining her accent, perfecting her role as Isabelle Dubois, the vulnerable young woman who had captured Schmidt's heart. She also practiced using the locket, rehearsing the moment when she would reveal it to Schmidt, the moment when she would claim it as her own, a memento of a fabricated past. It was a delicate dance of deception, a performance that had to be flawless. Finch, despite his injuries, helped her as much as he could. He reviewed the plan, identified potential pitfalls, and offered words of caution and encouragement. He also established a communication system, a series of coded signals that would allow them to stay in contact, to share information, to coordinate their efforts. As the day of the rendezvous approached, Rose felt a growing sense of apprehension, a mixture of fear and determination. She knew that she was walking into a lion's den, that one wrong move could cost her everything. She dressed carefully, choosing a simple, dark dress that accentuated her figure, but also conveyed a sense of vulnerability. She wore the locket around her neck, the silver chain hidden beneath her dress, the cool metal a constant reminder of her mission. She left the farmhouse under the cover of darkness, making her way back towards Amiens, her heart pounding with each step. She avoided the main roads, sticking to the shadows, her senses on high alert. She reached the designated meeting place, a small, deserted cafe on the outskirts of town, a place where Schmidt had taken her before. The cafe was closed, its windows dark and empty, but Rose knew that Schmidt would be waiting. She took a deep breath, steeling herself, and entered the cafe. The air was thick with the smell of stale coffee and dust. The room was dimly lit, the only source of light a single flickering candle on a nearby table. Schmidt was sitting at a table in the corner, his back to the door. He was dressed in civilian clothes, a dark suit that concealed his military identity. He looked up as Rose entered, his eyes widening in surprise. "Isabelle?" he said, his voice a mixture of disbelief and relief. What are you doing here?" Rose approached him slowly, her expression a mixture of fear and hope. "I had to see you, Heinrich," she said, her voice trembling slightly, her French accent carefully cultivated. I was so worried." Schmidt rose from his chair, his gaze fixed on her face. He reached out, taking her hand, his touch surprisingly gentle. "What happened?" he asked, his voice concerned. "Are you all right?" Rose recounted a fabricated story, a tale of being caught up in the raid on Le Chat Noir, of escaping with the help of a friend, of hiding in fear for her life. She embellished the story with details, with emotions, with tears, playing the role of the frightened, vulnerable young woman. Schmidt listened intently, his expression softening with each word. He believed her. He wanted to believe her. "I'm so sorry, Isabelle," he said, his voice filled with remorse. "I should have protected you. I should have known." Rose leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder, her body trembling slightly. She allowed herself a moment of genuine emotion, a release of the fear and the tension that had been building inside her. Then, she pulled away slightly, her hand reaching for the locket beneath her dress. She slowly revealed it, the silver gleaming in the candlelight. "This," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "This is all I have left. Of my family." Schmidt stared at the locket, his eyes widening in recognition. He reached out, his fingers tracing the delicate silver chain, the intricate design. Where did you get this?" he asked, his voice choked with emotion. Rose took a deep breath, her heart pounding. This was it. The moment of truth. It was my mother's, she said, her voice trembling. She gave it to me before she died. It's a family heirloom. Schmidt's gaze met hers, his eyes filled with a mixture of disbelief and hope. He recognized the locket. He knew it belonged to his wife. It can't be, he said, his voice barely a whisper. It's impossible. Rose met his gaze, her eyes filled with tears. She allowed the silence to hang in the air, the tension building, the deception reaching its climax. Then she nodded slowly. It is, she said, her voice soft but firm. It's the truth. Before he could question her further, before he could unravel the carefully constructed lie, she leaned in and kissed him. It was a desperate move, a calculated risk, but it was necessary. The kiss was a promise, a silent vow. She would play this role. She would deceive this man. She would do whatever it took to find Thomas. The memory of a different promise, one whispered beneath a London sky, years before, fueled her resolve. A promise to wait, to love, to never give up hope, no matter how many years, how many hardships stood in between. And this, now, was part of that promise. Chapter 13. The code within the locket. The kiss broke the spell, shifting Schmidt's focus from stunned disbelief to a more immediate, passionate response. Rose, though repulsed by the necessity of the act, allowed it to continue, using it as a cover to solidify the deception. She knew she had to play the role convincingly, to exploit Schmidt's emotional vulnerability to gain the information she needed. When they finally separated, Schmidt was visibly shaken, his emotions raw and exposed. He stared at the locket, his fingers tracing its contours, his mind struggling to reconcile the impossible. It's just like hers, he mumbled, his voice choked with emotion. The same, everything. Rose nodded, her eyes filled with feigned sadness. My mother, she never told me the full story, she said, her voice trembling slightly. She said it was a painful memory, a love lost. She let the implication hang in the air, allowing Schmidt to connect the dots, to believe that Rose was somehow connected to his deceased wife, a reincarnation of his lost love. Schmidt's grip on the locket tightened. He looked at Rose, his eyes filled with a mixture of longing and confusion. Who was your father? He asked, his voice hesitant. Rose had anticipated this question. She had prepared a fabricated answer, a plausible story that would further solidify the deception. I don't know, she said, her voice barely a whisper. My mother, she never told me. She said it was a secret, a forbidden love. She let the words sink in, allowing Schmidt to create his own narrative, to fill in the blanks with his own desires, his own hopes. Schmidt's mind was clearly racing, trying to make sense of the impossible. He was a man of logic, of order, but he was also a man consumed by grief, by loneliness. He wanted to believe, he needed to believe, that Rose was somehow connected to his lost love. He reached out, taking her hand, his touch gentle and possessive. Come with me, he said, his voice urgent. I need to think, to understand. Rose allowed herself to be led, following Schmidt out of the cafe and into the darkness of the Amiens night. They walked in silence, their footsteps echoing in the deserted streets. Schmidt led her to his apartment, a modest but comfortable dwelling located near the German headquarters. The apartment was sparsely furnished, reflecting Schmidt's solitary life, his focus on his military duties. Once inside, Schmidt poured them both a glass of brandy, his hand trembling slightly. He sat down on a worn leather armchair, gesturing for Rose to sit opposite him. He stared at the locket, his eyes filled with a mixture of wonder and suspicion. He was clearly struggling to reconcile his emotions with his rational mind. Tell me everything, he said, his voice low and intense. Tell me everything about your mother, about your family. Rose began to weave her fabricated tale, drawing on the details of her own life, but twisting them to fit the narrative she had created. She spoke of a childhood in Paris, of a loving mother who had died too young, of a secret past that had been shrouded in mystery. She spoke of a forbidden love, a brief but passionate affair between her mother and a German officer, a man she had never known. She spoke of the locket, the only memento of that lost love, a symbol of a past that had been hidden for too long. Schmidt listened intently, his eyes fixed on her face, his mind absorbing every word, every detail. He was captivated by her story, by her resemblance to his wife, by the impossible possibility that she was somehow connected to him. As Rose spoke, she noticed something. Something she hadn't noticed before. A tiny inscription on the inside of the locket, hidden beneath the miniature portrait of Schmidt's wife. She carefully opened the locket, pretending to examine it more closely. She tilted it towards the light, her fingers tracing the delicate silver frame. And there it was, a series of tiny numbers, etched into the silver, almost invisible to the naked eye. A code. Rose's heart leaped into her throat. This was it, the breakthrough they had been waiting for. The locket wasn't just a symbol of love, it was a key to unlocking a secret. She quickly memorized the numbers, her mind racing, trying to decipher their meaning. She knew she couldn't reveal her discovery to Schmidt, not yet. She had to play her role, to maintain the deception, until she had the opportunity to share the information with Finch. She closed the locket, her hand trembling slightly. She looked at Schmidt, her eyes filled with feigned sadness. It's all so confusing, she said, her voice trembling. I don't know what to believe. Schmidt reached out, taking her hand, his touch reassuring. Don't worry, Isabel, he said, his voice soft. I'll help you. We'll figure this out. Together. Rose allowed herself to be comforted, to be embraced by Schmidt, her mind racing, her heart pounding. She had the code, but she still needed to find out what it meant, where it led. And she knew that time was running out. The Germans were still searching for them, and Finch's assistant, the traitor, was still out there, somewhere. She looked into Schmidt's eyes and knew there was no turning back now. Not until she solved the code. And found Thomas. The locket felt heavy in her hand. Not just metal and portraits, but a key. And a burden. Chapter 14. Scars of the Past. Rose knew she had to get the code to Finch, but doing so under Schmidt's watchful eye was proving to be an almost insurmountable challenge. She was constantly under surveillance, her every move monitored, her every conversation scrutinized. Schmidt, consumed by his infatuation and the fantastical connection he believed they shared, was unwilling to let her out of his sight. She tried to find opportunities to slip away, to send a message to Finch, but Schmidt was always there, hovering, protective, his presence a constant reminder of the dangerous game she was playing. She considered trying to decipher the code herself, but she lacked the expertise, the knowledge of German military ciphers. She needed Finch, his experience, his contacts, to unlock the secret hidden within the locket. Days turned into nights, and Rose's anxiety grew. She was living a lie, trapped in a web of deception, her every action a performance, her every word a carefully crafted fabrication. She felt the pressure building, the strain of maintaining the facade, the fear of exposure. She began to see cracks in Schmidt's composure, subtle signs of doubt, of suspicion. He would question her about her past, about her family, about the locket, probing for inconsistencies, for flaws in her story. Rose parried his questions with a mixture of truth and carefully constructed lies, drawing on her own memories, her own experiences, to make her performance more convincing. But she knew she couldn't keep it up forever. One evening, Schmidt took her to a concert, a performance of classical music at the Amiens Town Hall. It was a rare public outing, a chance for Schmidt to show off his new love to his colleagues, to the local elite. Rose dressed carefully, choosing a gown that had belonged to Schmidt's wife, a beautiful, silk dress that accentuated her resemblance to the deceased woman. She wore the locket, the silver chain visible against her skin, a constant reminder of her mission. The concert was a lavish affair, the hall filled with German officers, their wives, and prominent members of the Amiens community. Rose felt the eyes of everyone upon her, scrutinizing her, judging her, questioning her. She maintained a facade of composure, smiling politely, engaging in small talk, playing the role of the charming, slightly naive young woman. But inside, she was a bundle of nerves, her heart pounding, her mind racing. During the intermission, Schmidt introduced her to several of his colleagues, high-ranking officers in the German intelligence network. Rose recognized one of them, a man she had seen at Le Chat Noir, a man who had been present on the night of Finch's capture. The man looked at her with suspicion, his eyes narrowing slightly. He had seen her before, he remembered her, and he knew she wasn't who she claimed to be. Rose felt a chill run down her spine. She knew she was in danger, that her cover was about to be blown. She excused herself, claiming a need to freshen up. She hurried to the ladies' room, her heart pounding, her mind racing. She needed to get out of there, to warn Finch, to escape before it was too late. She found a small window in the back of the ladies' room, a window that opened onto a deserted alleyway. It was a risky escape, but it was her only chance. She climbed through the window, dropping to the ground, her dress snagging on a rusty nail. She ignored the tear, her focus on getting away, on getting to safety. She ran through the dark alleyways, her footsteps echoing in the stillness. She didn't stop until she reached the outskirts of town, until she was far away from the concert hall, from Schmidt, from the prying eyes of the German officers. She made her way back to the abandoned farmhouse, her heart pounding, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She found Finch waiting for her, his face etched with worry. "Rose," he exclaimed, rushing to her side. "What happened? Are you all right?" Rose collapsed into his arms, her body trembling. She recounted the events of the evening, the encounter with the German officer, the growing suspicion, the desperate escape. "We have to leave, Finch," she said, her voice urgent. They know I'm not who I claim to be." Finch nodded, his face grim. "I know. I saw him. My assistant. He was at the concert. He saw you." Rose's blood ran cold. The traitor was still out there, still hunting them, still working for the Germans. "We have to get the code," Rose said, her voice determined. "We have to find out what it means." She opened the locket, revealing the tiny inscription, the series of numbers etched into the silver. Finch took the locket, his eyes examining the code closely. "It's a grid cipher," he said, his voice thoughtful. "A simple substitution cipher. But we need the key. The keyword." Rose racked her brain, trying to remember anything, any detail, that might provide a clue to the keyword. She thought about Schmidt, about his wife, about their life together, about the things he had told her. Then, she remembered something. Something Schmidt had said during the concert, a seemingly insignificant comment, but one that now took on a new meaning. "The music," Rose said, her voice excited. "He said it was his wife's favorite waltz. The waltz from the music box."
Annalise.
Finch's eyes widened.
"Of course," he said.
"The title of the waltz. It's the key." He quickly wrote down the code, applying the keyword Annalise to decipher the message. The numbers transformed into letters, the letters forming words, the words forming a sentence. A location.
Coordinates.
And a name. Les Ames Perdues. It was all coming together. The scars of his past, hers, the wars, it was all leading them, finally, to where they needed to be. Though together no longer meant what it once did. She looked at Finch. He was studying the decoded message, frowning slightly.
"What is it?"
she asked, already dreading the answer. He looked up, met her gaze.
"It's not good," he said.
Chapter 15. Across the barricades. Finch's words, "It's not good," hung in the air, heavy with unspoken dread. Rose felt a cold knot of fear tighten in her stomach. The coordinates they had deciphered, the location of Les Ames Perdues, weren't what they had expected. "What do you mean?" Rose asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Where is it?" Finch pointed to a map of the region, a detailed chart of the French countryside, marked with German fortifications, troop movements, and strategic locations. His finger landed on a spot, a remote area, deep within German-occupied territory. "It's here," he said, his voice grim, "near the front lines. Heavily guarded. Almost impossible to reach." Rose stared at the map, her heart sinking. The sanatorium wasn't just a prison. It was a fortress, a stronghold, protected by layers of defenses, surrounded by enemy soldiers. "But Thomas," Rose stammered. "He might be there." We have to. Finch interrupted her, his voice firm. I know, Rose. But we have to be realistic. We can't just walk in there. We'll be captured, killed. Rose knew he was right. A direct assault on Les Ames-Perdue's was out of the question. They were two people alone, against a heavily armed enemy. It would be suicide. But she couldn't give up. She had come too far, risked too much, to abandon Thomas now. She had to find a way to get to him, to rescue him. There has to be another way, Rose said, her voice desperate. A way to get inside. Undetected. Finch studied the map, his brow furrowed in concentration. He traced the lines of the fortifications, the positions of the German troops, the layout of the surrounding terrain. There's a supply route, he said, his voice thoughtful. A road that leads to the sanatorium. Used to transport provisions. Medical supplies. Rose's eyes lit up. Could we intercept a supply truck? She asked, her voice hopeful. Disguise ourselves as workers? Finch nodded slowly. It's possible. Risky. But it might be our only chance. It was a desperate plan, a long shot, but it was better than nothing. They would have to ambush a German supply truck, overpower the drivers, take their place, and infiltrate the sanatorium under the guise of delivering supplies. They spent the next few days planning, gathering information, preparing for the operation. Finch used his contacts, his network of informants, to learn more about the supply route, the schedule of the deliveries, the security measures in place. Rose, meanwhile, focused on acquiring the necessary supplies. German uniforms, weapons, forged documents. She used her remaining funds, her connections from her nursing days, to obtain the items they needed. As the day of the operation approached, Rose felt a growing sense of apprehension, a mixture of fear and determination. She knew that she was walking into a trap, that the chances of success were slim. But she had to try. She had to do everything in her power to save Thomas. They chose a secluded spot along the supply route, a stretch of road that was hidden from view, surrounded by dense forest. They waited patiently, hidden among the trees, their senses on high alert. Finally, they heard the sound of an approaching vehicle, the rumble of an engine, the crunch of tires on gravel. A German supply truck, a large, canvas-covered vehicle, came into view. Rose and Finch exchanged a look, a silent acknowledgement of the danger they were about to face. They stepped out onto the road, their weapons raised, their faces hidden behind masks. The truck screeched to a halt, the driver staring at them in disbelief. Rose and Finch acted quickly, overpowering the driver and his companion, binding and gagging them, hiding them in the forest. They donned the German uniforms, their hearts pounding, their hands trembling. They climbed into the truck, Rose taking the wheel, Finch sitting beside her, his weapon at the ready. They drove slowly, carefully, following the supply route towards Les Ames-Perdue's. The landscape grew increasingly bleak, the signs of war more evident. Bombed-out buildings, shattered trees, fields scarred with trenches and barbed wire. As they approached the sanatorium, Rose felt a knot of fear tighten in her stomach. The building loomed before them, a massive, imposing structure of gray stone, surrounded by a high wall, topped with barbed wire. Guard towers stood at each corner, manned by armed soldiers. They reached the main gate, a heavy iron barrier, guarded by 2 sentries. Rose stopped the truck, her heart pounding, her hands sweating. One of the sentries approached the truck, his eyes scrutinizing them suspiciously. He asked for their papers, their authorization. Rose handed him the forged documents, her hand trembling slightly. She held her breath, praying that they would pass inspection. The sentry examined the documents carefully, his eyes flickering between the papers and Rose's face. He seemed to be hesitating, uncertain. Then he nodded slowly. Proceed, he said, his voice gruff. The gate swung open, and Rose drove the truck through, entering the grounds of Les Ames-Perdue's. She felt a chill run down her spine. She was inside. She was one step closer to Thomas. But she also knew that she was in the heart of enemy territory, surrounded by danger, with no way out. She had crossed the barricades, not just of the sanatorium, but of her own past, her own fears. and she knew that there was no turning back now. Only forward. She glanced at Finch. His face was pale, set. He knew it too. Chapter 16. The Truth in the Trenches. The interior of Les Ames Perdue's was a stark contrast to its imposing exterior. While the walls were thick and the gates heavily guarded, the inside felt more like a dilapidated hospital than a fortress. The air was thick with the smell of disinfectant, stale food, and something indefinable, something that spoke of suffering and despair. Rose and Finch, still disguised as German supply workers, drove the truck to the designated unloading area, a courtyard at the back of the building. They were met by a gruff, overworked orderly who directed them to unload the supplies crates of medical equipment, bandages, and basic provisions. As they unloaded the crates, Rose scanned the surroundings, her eyes searching for any sign of Thomas, any clue to his whereabouts. The courtyard was filled with activity, patients wandering aimlessly, nurses rushing from one ward to another, guards patrolling the perimeter. She saw faces etched with pain, with loss, with a haunting emptiness. She saw men with missing limbs, with bandaged heads, with vacant stares. She saw the scars of war, the physical and psychological wounds that would never fully heal. She didn't see Thomas. Rose and Finch finished unloading the supplies, their hearts sinking with each passing moment. They had risked everything to get inside Les Ames Perdue's, but they were no closer to finding Thomas than they had been before. The orderly, impatient and suspicious, ordered them to leave. "Get out," he barked. "And don't come back unless you have proper authorization." Rose and Finch knew they couldn't linger. They had to get out of the courtyard, to explore the sanatorium, to find Thomas before their disguise was discovered. They pretended to leave, driving the truck a short distance, then parking it behind a row of outbuildings, hidden from view. They slipped out of the truck, their weapons concealed beneath their uniforms, their senses on high alert. They made their way back towards the main building, moving stealthily, avoiding contact with the patients, the nurses, the guards. They knew that one wrong move, one suspicious glance could expose them, could lead to their capture. They explored the corridors, peering into the wards, the treatment rooms, the offices. They saw rows of beds filled with wounded soldiers, men suffering from shell shock, from gas poisoning, from the horrors of the trenches. They saw nurses working tirelessly, tending to the patients, their faces etched with exhaustion and compassion. They saw doctors performing surgeries, amputations, their hands stained with blood. They saw the grim reality of war, the human cost of conflict. But they didn't see Thomas. As they continued their search, they came across a locked door, a heavy wooden door with a small, barred window. The door was marked with a single word, isolarium. Isolation. Rose felt a surge of adrenaline. This could be it. This could be where Thomas was being held. She tried the door, but it was locked, secured with a heavy padlock. She looked at Finch, her eyes filled with a mixture of hope and desperation. Finch examined the lock, his brow furrowed in concentration. He pulled out a small set of tools, a lock-picking kit that he had concealed in his uniform. He worked quickly and efficiently, his fingers manipulating the delicate instruments, his ears listening for the telltale click of the tumblers. After a few tense moments, the lock clicked open. Finch pushed the door open slowly, cautiously, his weapon raised. They stepped inside, their hearts pounding. The room was small, dimly lit, and sparsely furnished. There was a single bed, a small table, and a chair. And there, lying on the bed, was a man who was barely recognizable. He was emaciated, his body thin and frail. His face was gaunt, his eyes sunken, his skin pale and translucent. He was covered in scars, bruises, and wounds, the marks of torture, of brutality, of unspeakable suffering. But Rose recognized him. She recognized the shape of his jaw, the curve of his brow, the faint scar above his left eye. It was Thomas. Rose rushed to his side, her heart breaking at the sight of him. She knelt beside the bed, gently touching his hand, her tears flowing freely. "Thomas," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "It's me. It's Rose." Thomas's eyes flickered open. He stared at her, his gaze unfocused, his mind struggling to comprehend. "Rose?" he mumbled, his voice weak, barely audible. "Is it really you?" Rose nodded, her tears blurring her vision. "Yes, Thomas. It's me. I'm here. I've come to take you home." Thomas's eyes filled with a mixture of disbelief and relief. A faint smile touched his lips. "You found me," he whispered. Rose gently helped him to sit up, supporting his frail body. She looked at Finch, her eyes filled with gratitude and urgency. "We have to get him out of here," she said.
"Now."
Finch nodded, his face grim. He knew that their time was running out, that the Germans could discover them at any moment. They had found Thomas, but their mission was far from over. As they prepared to leave, Thomas reached out, his hand grasping Rose's arm. "Wait," he whispered. "There's something you need to know." He struggled to speak, his voice weak and strained. "The betrayal," he whispered. It wasn't just Finch's assistant. He coughed, a racking, painful sound. There was someone else. Rose's blood ran cold. Another traitor? Who? Thomas struggled to take a breath and looked Rose directly in her eyes. Then he said it. The name. And Rose's world shattered. Chapter 17. A desperate gamble. Thomas's revelation, the name he uttered with his last ounce of strength, was a blow that sent Rose reeling. It was a name she knew, a name she had trusted, a name that was inextricably linked to her past, to her present, to her very being. Madeline, Thomas had whispered, his voice barely audible, before collapsing back onto the bed, unconscious. Madeline, the woman who had helped them, who had provided them with information, with shelter, with a plan. The woman who had seemed so genuinely concerned, so eager to assist them in their mission. It couldn't be true. It had to be a mistake, a misunderstanding, a delusion brought on by Thomas's weakened state. But Rose knew, deep down, that it wasn't. She remembered Madeline's hesitation, her guarded expressions, her subtle evasiveness. She remembered the look of guilt on her face when Finch was captured at Le Chat Noir. Madeline had played them. She had used them, manipulated them, betrayed them. She had been working for the Germans all along, feeding them information, leading them into a trap. The realization sent a wave of anger, of betrayal, of despair, washing over Rose. She had trusted Madeline. She had confided in her. She had believed in her. And all along, Madeline had been their enemy. But there was no time for grief, for anger, for recriminations. They had to get Thomas out of Les Ames-Perdue's to safety before the Germans discovered them. Finch, who had been stunned into silence by Thomas's revelation, finally stirred. "We have to go," he said, his voice urgent.
"Now."
They gently lifted Thomas from the bed, supporting his frail body between them. They carried him out of the isolation room, back into the corridors of the sanatorium, their hearts pounding, their senses on high alert. They moved quickly and quietly, avoiding contact with the patients, the nurses, the guards. They knew that every second counted, that their escape could be discovered at any moment. They reached the outbuildings where they had hidden the truck, their hopes rising with each step. They were so close to freedom, so close to getting Thomas to safety. But as they reached the truck, they saw them. German soldiers, dozens of them, surrounding the vehicle, their weapons raised, their faces grim. They had been discovered. The alarm had been raised. Their escape had been thwarted. Rose and Finch exchanged a look, a silent acknowledgement of the desperate situation they were in. They were trapped, outnumbered, outgunned. There was no way out. But Rose refused to surrender. She had come too far, risked too much, to give up now. She would fight. She would protect Thomas. She would do whatever it took to get him out of there, even if it meant sacrificing her own life. She gently placed Thomas on the ground, leaning him against the side of the truck. She drew her pistol, her hand trembling slightly, but her resolve firm. "Finch," she said, her voice low and steady. "Take Thomas. Get him out of here. I'll cover you." Finch looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of admiration and despair. He knew what she was offering, what she was willing to do. "Rose, no," he said, his voice choked with emotion. Well, we'll fight together.
Rose shook her head. There's no time, she said.
You have to go.
Now.
Take Thomas. Get him to safety. That's all that matters. She handed him the forged documents, the authorization papers they had used to enter the sanatorium. Use these, she said. They might buy you some time. Finch hesitated, his eyes searching her face. He knew she was right. He knew that he had to take Thomas to get him to safety. But he couldn't leave her, not like this. I won't forget you, Rose, he said, his voice trembling. Rose smiled faintly, her eyes filled with tears. Go, she said.
Now.
Before it's too late. Finch nodded, his face grim. He gently lifted Thomas, carrying him towards the back of the truck. He climbed inside, his movements slow and deliberate. Rose watched them, her heart breaking. She knew that this might be the last time she saw them, the last time she saw Thomas. She turned to face the approaching soldiers, her pistol raised, her finger on the trigger. She would buy them time. She would give them a chance to escape. She fired, the shots ringing out in the silence, echoing through the courtyard. The soldiers returned fire, the bullets whizzing past her, hitting the side of the truck. Rose fought bravely, fiercely, her every shot aimed with precision. She was a woman transformed, a warrior, driven by love, by loyalty, by a desperate hope. But she knew it was a losing battle. She was outnumbered, outgunned, surrounded. She couldn't hold them off forever. She felt a sharp pain in her shoulder, a burning sensation that spread through her body. She had been hit. She stumbled, her vision blurring, her strength ebbing away. She fell to her knees, her pistol slipping from her grasp. The soldiers closed in, their faces grim, their weapons trained on her. Rose looked up at them, her eyes defiant, her spirit unbroken. She had done all she could. She had bought Finch and Thomas time. She had fought for what she believed in. She had kept her promise. As the soldiers approached, Rose closed her eyes, waiting for the inevitable. But then, she heard a different sound. A rumble, a roar, a sound that grew louder and louder. She opened her eyes, looking up in disbelief. It was a British tank crashing through the gates of the sanatorium, followed by a wave of Allied soldiers. The cavalry had arrived. The armistice had been declared. But for Rose, caught between the retreating Germans and the advancing Allies, it was unclear if she would live to see the peace. The world was a blur of gunfire and explosions. And then, darkness. Chapter 18. The Reckoning at Dawn. Rose drifted in and out of consciousness, her mind a swirling vortex of pain, confusion, and fragmented memories. She heard shouts, screams, the roar of engines, the thunder of gunfire, but it all seemed distant, muffled, unreal. She felt hands lifting her, carrying her, her body jolted by the uneven movement. She felt the sting of a needle, the prick of a bandage, the pressure of a hand on her forehead. She opened her eyes, blinking against the harsh light. She was in a makeshift hospital, a field tent filled with wounded soldiers, the air thick with the smell of blood, disinfectant, and fear. She saw nurses rushing from one bed to another, their faces etched with exhaustion and determination. She saw doctors performing surgeries, amputations, their hands stained with red. She saw the chaos of war, the aftermath of battle, the human cost of conflict. But she didn't see Finch. Or Thomas. She tried to sit up, her body screaming in protest. A nurse rushed to her side, gently pushing her back down. Easy, love, the nurse said, her voice kind but firm. You've been shot. You need to rest. Finch, Rose mumbled, her voice weak. Thomas, where are they? The nurse hesitated, her eyes flickering with a mixture of concern and pity. They brought you in, she said. A British officer and a patient. They were in a bad way. Rose's heart sank. She knew what the nurse was trying to say. Finch and Thomas were gone. No, Rose whispered, her tears flowing freely. It can't be. I have to. The nurse gently stroked her forehead, her touch soothing. Rest, love, she said. There's nothing you can do now. Just rest. Rose closed her eyes, her mind reeling. She had lost them. She had lost everything. She had failed. But as she drifted back into unconsciousness, she heard a voice, a familiar voice, calling her name. Rose, she opened her eyes again, blinking against the light. She saw a figure standing beside her bed, a figure she recognized, a figure she had thought she would never see again. It was Finch. He was bruised and battered, his arm in a sling, but he was alive. Finch, Rose whispered, her voice filled with disbelief and relief. You're alive. Finch smiled weakly, his eyes filled with tears. Yes, Rose, he said.
I'm alive. Thanks to you.
Rose tried to sit up again, her body protesting, but Finch gently restrained her. Easy, Rose, he said.
You need to rest.
You've lost a lot of blood. Thomas, Rose mumbled. Where is he? Is he? Finch hesitated, his eyes flickering with sadness.
He's alive, he said. But he's not well.
He's in a coma. The doctors, they don't know if Rose's heart ached. Thomas was alive, but he was hanging by a thread, his fate uncertain. She had saved him from Les Ames Perdue's, but she hadn't been able to save him from the scars of the past, from the horrors he had endured. I have to see him, Rose said, her voice determined. Finch nodded.
I know, he said. But not now. You need to rest.
You need to regain your strength. Rose reluctantly agreed. She knew she was in no condition to see Thomas, to help him. She had to heal, to recover, to be strong for him. She spent the next few days in the field hospital, slowly regaining her strength. She was treated for her gunshot wound, her body gradually mending, her spirit slowly healing. Finch visited her every day, keeping her updated on Thomas's condition, on the progress of the war, on the aftermath of the armistice. He told her about the battle at Les Ames Perdue's, about the arrival of the Allied forces, about the capture of the German soldiers, about the liberation of the patients. He told her about Madeline, about her betrayal, about her capture. He told her that Madeline had been working for the Germans all along, feeding them information, sabotaging Allied operations. Rose listened, her heart filled with a mixture of anger, betrayal, and sadness. She had trusted Madeline, she had believed in her, and she had been betrayed. But she also felt a sense of closure, a sense of justice. Madeline had been caught, her treachery exposed, her reign of terror ended. As Rose recovered, she began to think about the future, about what she would do, about where she would go. She knew she couldn't go back to her old life, to her old routines. The war had changed her, had transformed her, had left her with scars that would never fully heal. She knew she had to stay, to be near Thomas, to help him recover, to support him in his journey back to health. Finally, the day came when she was strong enough to see him. She walked slowly, hesitantly, towards his room, her heart pounding, her hands trembling. She entered the room, her eyes searching for him. He was lying in a bed, his body still and frail, his face pale and gaunt. He was hooked up to machines, monitors beeping softly, tubes and wires connecting him to life support. Rose approached the bed, her tears flowing freely. She gently took his hand, her touch tender and loving. Thomas, she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. It's me. It's Rose. I'm here. I'm not leaving you. She sat beside him, holding his hand, talking to him, telling him about her love, about her hopes, about her dreams for their future. She didn't know if he could hear her, if he could understand her, but she had to try. She had to reach him, to bring him back from the darkness.
As she sat there, she noticed something.
A faint movement, a flicker of his eyelids, a twitch of his fingers. She leaned closer, her heart pounding with hope. Thomas? She whispered. Can you hear me? His eyes slowly opened. He stared at her, his gaze weak but focused. Rose, he mumbled, his voice barely audible. You came back. Rose smiled, her tears flowing freely. Yes, Thomas, she said. I came back. And I'm not leaving you. Ever. It was a new beginning, a new dawn. A dawn filled with uncertainty, with challenges, with the long road to recovery. But it was also a dawn filled with hope, with love, with the promise of a future together. A reckoning at long last. Not with the enemy, but with the past. Chapter 19. Flight from the Flames. Thomas's return to consciousness was not a triumphant awakening, but a fragile, flickering ember of life, rekindled against all odds. He was weak, disoriented, his body ravaged by months of torture and deprivation. His mind, too, was scarred, haunted by the horrors he had endured, the secrets he had carried. Rose stayed by his side, day and night, tending to his needs, whispering words of comfort and encouragement, her love a constant beacon in the darkness of his recovery. She became his anchor, his lifeline, his connection to the world he had almost lost. The field hospital, initially a haven, soon became a target. With the armistice signed, the front lines shifted, and the area around Les Ames-Perdue's became increasingly unstable. Rumors of rogue German units, unwilling to surrender, circulated among the staff and patients. Finch, who had been instrumental in coordinating the evacuation of the remaining patients, urged Rose to leave with Thomas. "It's not safe here, Rose," he said, his face etched with concern. "We need to get Thomas to a proper hospital, to a place where he can receive the care he needs." Rose was reluctant to leave Finch, to abandon the other wounded soldiers, but she knew he was right. Thomas's life was paramount, and she had to do everything in her power to protect him. They secured passage on a medical transport, a converted ambulance heading towards Paris. The journey was arduous, the roads bumpy and treacherous, the constant threat of attack looming over them. Rose sat beside Thomas, holding his hand, her eyes constantly scanning the surroundings, her senses on high alert. She knew that they were still vulnerable, that danger lurked around every corner. As they neared Paris, they saw it. Smoke rising in the distance, flames licking the sky, the sounds of explosions echoing through the air. The city was under attack. The driver of the ambulance, panicked and disoriented, lost control of the vehicle. The ambulance swerved, crashing into a ditch, the impact throwing Rose and Thomas against the metal walls. Rose, dazed but conscious, quickly assessed the situation. The driver was dead, the ambulance was wrecked, and they were stranded, miles from safety, in the midst of a war zone. She gently checked on Thomas. He was unconscious, his breathing shallow and irregular. She had to get him out of there, to find shelter, to protect him from the approaching flames. She managed to pull Thomas from the wreckage, his body limp and unresponsive. She carried him, her strength fueled by adrenaline and a desperate love, towards a nearby farmhouse, a small, stone building that offered a semblance of protection. She found the farmhouse deserted, its occupants having fled the approaching conflict. She laid Thomas on a bed, her heart pounding, her hands trembling. She examined his injuries, her medical training kicking in. He had a head wound, several broken ribs, and internal bleeding. He needed immediate medical attention, but there was no one to help, no supplies, no hope. Rose refused to give up. She used her own clothes to bandage his wounds, to staunch the bleeding. She found some water, cleaning his face, his body, her touch gentle and loving. She spoke to him, whispering words of comfort and encouragement, her voice a constant presence in the silence of the farmhouse. She told him about her love, about her hopes, about her dreams for their future. As the hours passed, the sounds of the battle grew closer, the flames casting an eerie glow on the walls of the farmhouse. Rose knew that they were running out of time, that the fire would soon engulf them. She made a decision. She couldn't stay there, waiting for death. She had to find a way out, a way to safety, a way to save Thomas. She fashioned a makeshift stretcher from blankets and wooden planks, her ingenuity born of desperation. She gently lifted Thomas onto the stretcher, her body screaming in protest, but her resolve unwavering. She dragged the stretcher out of the farmhouse, into the night, the flames licking at her heels, the smoke choking her lungs. She moved slowly, painfully, her every step in agony, but she didn't stop. She followed a dirt track, a path that led away from the city, away from the flames, away from the war. She didn't know where she was going. She didn't know if she would survive, but she had to try. She walked for hours, her body exhausted, her spirit drained, but her love for Thomas a constant source of strength. She stumbled, she fell, but she always got back up, always kept moving.
As dawn approached, she saw it.
A small village, nestled in a valley, untouched by the flames, a haven of peace in a world of chaos. She reached the village, her strength almost gone, her body on the verge of collapse. She collapsed at the entrance to the village, her stretcher falling beside her, her cries for help a desperate plea. The villagers found them, taking them in, caring for them, providing them with shelter, with food, with medical attention. Rose had saved Thomas. She had brought him out of the flames, out of the darkness, into the light. But their journey was far from over. The flames were not just outside. They were also within. She had to flee the burning wreckage of her trust, of her past. But for now, she was safe. And so was he. She looked down at Thomas, still unconscious, but breathing. That was all that mattered for now. Chapter 20. The name restored. The village, nestled in a tranquil valley seemingly untouched by the ravages of war, became their sanctuary. The villagers, simple farming folk, welcomed Rose and Thomas with open arms, their generosity and kindness a stark contrast to the brutality and betrayal they had experienced. Thomas, though still unconscious, slowly began to heal. The village doctor, a kind, elderly man with limited resources but a wealth of experience, tended to his wounds, providing him with the best care he could offer. Rose never left Thomas's side, watching over him, caring for him, her love a constant vigil. She spoke to him, read to him, sang to him, her voice a familiar comfort in the unfamiliar surroundings. Days turned into weeks, and slowly, gradually, Thomas began to show signs of improvement. His breathing became stronger, his fever subsided, his wounds began to heal. One morning, as Rose sat beside his bed, holding his hand, she saw it. A flicker of his eyelids, a twitch of his fingers, a subtle movement of his lips. "Thomas?" she whispered, her heart pounding with hope. "Can you hear me?" His eyes slowly opened. He stared at her, his gaze weak but focused. "Rose," he mumbled, his voice barely audible. "Where are we?" Rose smiled, her tears flowing freely. "We're safe, Thomas," she said. "We're in a village, far away from the war." Thomas's eyes filled with confusion. "The fire," he whispered. The ambulance. Rose gently stroked his forehead, her touch soothing. "It's all right, Thomas," she said. "You're safe now. You're with me." Thomas slowly began to remember, the fragmented memories of the past returning in flashes, in nightmares, in moments of clarity. He remembered the torture, the imprisonment, the betrayal. He remembered Rose, her courage, her love, her unwavering determination to save him. As Thomas recovered, Rose began to think about the future, about what they would do, about where they would go. She knew they couldn't stay in the village forever. They needed to return to England, to rebuild their lives, to find a way to heal from the scars of the war. Finch, who had been searching for them tirelessly, finally found them. He had tracked them down through a network of contacts, following the trail of rumors and reports of a British officer and a woman rescued from a burning ambulance. He arrived in the village, his face etched with relief and joy. He embraced Rose, his eyes filled with tears. I thought I'd lost you both," he said, his voice choked with emotion. He sat with Thomas, listening to his story, offering words of comfort and support. He told them about the end of the war, about the armistice, about the efforts to rebuild a shattered world. He also told them about Madeline. She had been tried and convicted of treason, sentenced to a long prison term. Justice of a sort had been served. With Finch's help, Rose and Thomas were able to return to England. They traveled by train, by ship, by car. Their journey a slow and arduous one, but their spirits lifted with each passing mile. They arrived in London, a city scarred by war, but also filled with a sense of hope, of renewal. The streets were bustling with activity, people celebrating the end of the conflict, rebuilding their lives, looking towards the future. Rose and Thomas found a small cottage in the countryside, a quiet, peaceful place where they could heal, where they could rebuild their lives, where they could start anew. They spent their days tending to their garden, walking in the fields, reading by the fire, their love a constant source of strength and comfort. Thomas slowly recovered, his body healing, his mind gradually regaining its clarity. But the scars of the past remained, the memories of the war, the torture, the betrayal, haunting him in his dreams, in his waking hours. Rose was always there for him, her love a constant presence, her support unwavering. She helped him to confront his demons, to face his fears, to find a way to live with the pain. One day, Rose took Thomas back to the small borough where she had first seen the war memorial, the memorial where his name had vanished. They stood before the memorial, hand in hand, their eyes fixed on the smooth, blank space where his name should have been. "It's still not there," Rose said, her voice soft. Thomas nodded, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and acceptance. "It doesn't matter," he said. "I'm here.
I'm alive."
That's all that matters." But Rose knew it did matter. It mattered to her. It mattered to Thomas. It mattered to all those who had sacrificed their lives for their country. She made a decision. She would fight to have Thomas's name restored, to have his sacrifice recognized, to have his honor acknowledged. She went back to the War Office. She spoke to officials. She wrote letters. She gathered evidence. She told her story. She fought tirelessly, relentlessly, her determination fueled by love, by loyalty, by a sense of justice. And finally, after months of effort, she succeeded. The War Office agreed to restore Thomas's name to the memorial, to acknowledge his service, to honor his sacrifice. On a bright, sunny morning, Rose and Thomas stood before the memorial once again, this time surrounded by friends, by family, by fellow soldiers. They watched as a stonemason carefully carved Thomas's name into the granite, the letters slowly appearing one by one. "Captain Thomas Sinclair." Rose felt a surge of emotion, a mixture of pride, of joy, of relief. Thomas's name had been restored. His honor had been vindicated. His sacrifice had been acknowledged. She looked at Thomas, his eyes filled with tears. He smiled at her, his love shining through the scars of the past. They had survived. They had overcome. They had found their way back to each other, back to life, back to love. The name was restored, not just on the stone, but in their hearts, and in their future, together.
Epilogue.
The years that followed were a tapestry woven with threads of joy and sorrow, of healing and remembrance. Rose and Thomas settled into their quiet life in the countryside, their cottage a haven of peace and tranquility, a sanctuary from the lingering shadows of the war. Thomas, though forever marked by his experiences, gradually found a measure of solace. He took up gardening, finding therapy in the nurturing of life, in the gentle rhythm of the seasons. He wrote poetry, his words a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, a reflection of the beauty he found in the world around him. Rose, too, found ways to heal. She volunteered at a local hospital, tending to the wounded and the sick, her compassion and skill a balm to those in need. She continued to write to Finch, their correspondence a lifeline to the past, a shared understanding of the sacrifices they had made, the secrets they had kept. They never forgot the war, the horrors they had witnessed, the friends they had lost. They honored the memory of those who had fallen, visiting the war memorial each year, placing a single red rose beneath Thomas's name, a symbol of their enduring love and remembrance. Their cottage became a gathering place for fellow veterans, for those who had shared the burden of war, for those who understood the unspoken language of trauma and resilience. They shared stories, laughter, and tears, their bonds forged in the crucible of conflict. One spring morning, many years after their return to England, Rose and Thomas were walking in their garden, the air filled with the scent of blossoms, the birdsong a symphony of life. Thomas stopped, his hand gently touching a rose bush, its blooms of vibrant crimson. "Do you remember, Rose," he said, his voice soft, "the red lantern at Le Chat Noir?" Rose nodded, her eyes filling with tears. She remembered the darkness, the fear, the betrayal. She remembered the desperate gamble, the audacious plan, the unwavering hope. "And do you remember," Thomas continued, his gaze meeting hers, "the promise by the Thames?" Rose smiled, her heart overflowing with love. She remembered the whispered vows, the stolen moments, the unwavering commitment. "I remember," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "I remember everything." They stood there, hand in hand, their love a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit, a beacon of hope in a world scarred by war. They had faced death, betrayal, and despair, but they had survived. They had found their way back to each other, back to life, back to love. And as they looked out at their garden, at the beauty that surrounded them, they knew that their journey, though marked by sorrow, had ultimately led them to a place of peace, of healing, of enduring love. A love that had been tested by fire, forged in the crucible of war, and restored, like a name carved in stone, for all eternity. The sun was warm on their faces. And, together, finally they were home. The end.